One of the hurdles, and my hope and intention is for this podcast to sort of lower the barriers to entry for working on these kinds of problems, is that, when you think about battery technology and chemistry and biology, these are like very technical field with deep science, and a lot of folks who work in that field, have really, labored for many hours in wet labs and, pipetting and growing cells, and it's just a really tough field to come up through. And there's an incredible amount of depth and complexity to it, seemingly infinite. Somebody recently described as, for example, a human cell as a black box full of a million, other black boxes inside of it. You have this really interesting background in math and kind of on the computational side, and yet you have, not just dabbled, but really, it seems like, dug in and leaned in to applications of, ML, AI for these spaces. How did you get up to speed? How did you overcome that barrier to find a way to add value?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think it can be definitely really scary as someone starting in the field to be like, where do I even get started, right? I think there's a ton of jargon that's used in the field for people that have spent decades just working on these things. But yeah, I'd say I did a combination of a few things. I mean, even this past summer, I actually started just like a reading group where I was reading a few textbooks that the people that I was working with at CZ Biohub had recommended, and I just started, they let me borrow their textbook, and I was just like spending time after work reading it, and it was a ton of fun. And so I just posted about it and like got a ton of interest from other people that were in a similar position. And so we started this like really informal reading group where it was just us sort of reading different papers or textbooks, and then just hopping on a call once in a while about, just chatting about what we learned and if we had any questions and just walking through it together. And I think that's a really good way to learn is, if you can synthesize a really technical topic and share it with someone else, I think that's a really good test of your own understanding. So one thing I'd say is definitely lean into like the textbooks and sort of like the more traditional, resources that are out there that do help you get a baseline understanding. Obviously, I think another thing is getting hands-on and working on projects. So I think the work that I did at CZ Biohub was really helpful and complementary as I was learning and reading those textbooks, because I was able to sort of see I was doing a ton of work with like single cells and really diving deep into the organelles and the dynamics of how these organelles are changing and shifting due to different perturbations. And so really understanding, okay, these are the organelles that I was just learning about, here's what they actually look like, and here's how they change over time. And so I think doing an applied project is really useful. And I'd say the third thing is like definitely, to practically really understand things, you do have to get into a wet lab and get your hands dirty with some of the tools. Even if, you're not the wet lab person, maybe you enjoy the computational work more, I think that's okay. But I do think there is a lot of value in actually learning the skills of being in a wet lab. So I spent a ton of time just like shadowing, and also even, in the summer, that was something that I tried to get closer to with the people who were collecting the data and doing the experiments, just, even just chatting with them and understanding how do they go about designing these experiments and how does that tie into the downstream work of the algorithms that I'm building. So I think one, spending time shadowing people, being in the wet lab, but also chatting with the biologists and really understanding what they're working on.
That's great. Well, one is shout out to textbooks. I feel like, I went to college a long time ago, felt like textbooks were on their way out, but great to see that they still provide some value and can be kind of a cool resource for a study group. I also want to give a shout out to, in the Bay Area, there's an organization that I've been kind of helping out with. They're called Celsius. I think they're changing their name to Biopunk Hackers or something, but needless to say, they are essentially a community like wet lab space. They provide all sorts of training and access. I imagine that's not unique to the Bay Area, but there are some really cool folks, I think, who are trying to make this science and being able to go into a wet lab a lot more accessible for folks.
Yeah.
One of the things that I heard that even surprised me was that sometimes folks who even work in industry at these large companies, they themselves, maybe because of understandable protocols and so forth, aren't actually able to get access to wet labs, even if they want to, let's say if they work on the dry side. So I think folks who are willing to maybe take a bet and help somebody out or create these kinds of organizations are just really helpful for making that more accessible.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of like open spaces in SF definitely that have just like, space you can rent out. And but also I think, I have a friend who goes to like, he goes to UMich, and he was mentioning there's like just like a class you can take where you can just like learn about sort of like the fundamental skills in wet lab. And so he came from like a more neuroscience background, and so that really helped him just get up to speed with just like what are sort of like the main protocols and things to be aware of when you're like designing different experiments and collecting data. And so I think it really helps to have someone who has spent a lot of time doing that walk you through it. And I think you reach a point where, you know, things become a lot more clear and like repetitive, and then you're able to sort of apply those skills yourself.